and welcome back to the vlog. Solo. It's just me today. And I'm talking about the state of exception and social power. Now, we've already talked about Hobbes and we've talked about Bataille. We talked about all kinds of conceptions of sovereignty, but I haven't really even gone to the etymology of the word. Sovereign is posited and only appears in English in about the 14th century, around the time of Hobbes, actually, a little bit before that, as coming from the Latin superanus, which means super above, and anus meaning something like ian or pertaining to. It's a suffix. And it's come from vulgar Latin, common everyday Latin. The problem is we don't have any attestation for that phraseology. There's no example of super honest being used in vulgar Latin anywhere. And sovereign seems to be like a portmanteau with reign, which is a dynasty occupation of the office of a monarch of a nation or a people's. So nations, once you get to territorialization of a people's, when you're dealing with deterritorialized peoples. So the Franks, as I used to that example a lot before it becomes France. So the reign of Charlemagne or the Merovingians or whatever before you have an established territory. Now, the word reign is pretty old. It seems to come actually from the Latin interregnum. And it is a verb that becomes a noun. It comes from Old French, which seems to come from reunir, to reign, and which comes from regnum or interregnum. So it still kind of comes from Latin, but there's no way to get super honest into sovereign or super interregnum because that wouldn't refer to a person. And it's very clear that sovereign actually, in its earliest conceptions, does not refer to abstract conceptions of government like you might see in Polybius or Aristotle or Plato, but to a specific reign of an individual or family or a dynasty. So that's where it comes from. The sovereign is interesting because the sovereign is the legitimate authority over a polity that has supreme executive authority. That becomes the basis of sovereignty in international law, which is the exercise of power by a state in the Westphalian state system. So the sovereign can be the people of a state, which is a change in the conception here, but it is what justifies the government of a nation state or a state. Whereas reigns could refer to, and also princeps and other forms of liberty could refer to things that actually weren't just tied to state or government functions. So there's a long history here. And this is nerd shit, I'm not going to lie. But it's important to understand the development of the idea of sovereign as the deciding chief. And how that gets used by the time that it's used in Leviathan in the 15th century, which the word's only been in English for about 100 years at that point, to establish this idea that the sovereign is the person who decides the rules. And there's really two forms of sovereignty. There's de jure sovereignty, which refers to the legal right to rule, and de facto sovereignty, which refers to who actually rules. So in the United States, Congress and the judiciary and the president are de jure sovereigns. But due to the nature of presidential exceptionalism, with some limitations, the de facto sovereign is the executive branch and the administrative state and the president, with clear limits. Now, we need to understand this. We've talked about how this came up in Hobbes, but we have to jump to the state of exception. Because the state of exception not just ties into the idea of the sovereign, because the sovereign decides of the state of exception, but also ideas like dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, I get the baggage with dictatorship of the proletariat. I don't like the term. You cannot undo the 20th century shift of the meaning of dictatorship. But dictatorship's meaning historically is unitary executive power in a state of emergency. All right. And there are times, even in the United States Constitution, where we have powers like that. The state of exception is not like the state of emergency, because the state of exception is tied into sovereignty in a key way. And this is Carl Schmitt's contribution to Hobbesian thought. Now, we all know that Schmitt was a Nazi and never really recanted. But the rule of law is dependent on the sovereign in Hobbesian thinking. So Schmitt's actually drawing out something in Hobbes. Now, he might be interpreting it in a completely different way than Hobbes. But Schmitt's point is that to maintain the public good, and he's got the public good here is defined for him in terms of political theology. We could go into that. That's a big question. The state of exception is where the sovereign, which is the legitimate heir of the party, can transcend the rule of law arbitrarily to maintain that good. The state of emergency was introduced by Hobbes in a 1921 essay called On Dictatorship, which is about the weakness of the Weimar Constitution. But the state of exception of sovereignty is really developed in the political theology book. Now, what Schmitt was doing, I think, having read both texts, was taking Hobbesian political thought and applying it to the Machiavellian Republican political thought about the state of emergency and the need for dictatorship. Right? In the Roman Republic, the dictator was a single person allowed to take extraordinary measures, transcending the rule of law, under strict controls for a limited period of time. This was dropped from Western jurisprudence during most of the Christian era, because under monarchs, this was not the case. Now, the idea of the God-given absolute monarch is actually not a medieval concept. It's an early modern concept, drawing on medieval concepts, but they weren't what the medievals actually thought. Yes, the monarch was ordained by God, but the monarch could lose that ordainship. It wasn't just because the monarch said something was good that it was good, and nor was it actually the way any of these things were practiced. Go back and read Gregory of Tours to see that in the Merovingian kings or any history of the Normans, etc., etc., etc. It was really Renaissance thinkers, particularly Machiavelli, but also Benton, who discussed the need for a dictator to set the question of how to deal with emergencies where democracy could not handle it without degenerating back into monarchy and a kind of permanent state of emergency or a permanent state of executive fiat. So it's trying to removed from the concept of like the Princeps Maximus, the emperor, the imperator, from the concept of kingship, and return sovereignty back to an early Republican way. And this is a very Renaissance way of thinking, to go back to the early Roman Republic, where this institution, which was also part of the undoing of the Roman Empire, would be dealt with. Now, the U.S. Constitution actually does allow, for example, the suspension of habeas corpus in times of emergency, but an emergency is not really clearly stated. In times of war is clear, but it requires the agreement of Congress. The executive cannot do this power by itself, at least historically. Now, executive kind of can now, but under police powers and the War Powers Act and all that, there's a lot more power in the executive than there was classically in the U.S. Constitution. The French Constitution of 1848 stated that the law should be passed defining a state of exception, but doesn't give the state of exception in the Constitution for when you could invoke it. And then even in the Weimar Constitution, which included Article 48, which is kind of infamous because of, how certain things happened and led to World War II, and thus the beginning of this crediting of the idea of the dictatorship as a legitimate way to deal with a state of emergency in bourgeois constitutional republics. It was still true that the state of emergency powers was actually never really clearly legally defined. So Schmitt was definitely picking up on this in his 1921 essay on dictatorship. But it really took him to develop his political theology to really draw out the state of exception. Now, this concept got revived in the aughts, mostly from Gorgio Agamben's work, The State of Exception, from 2005. It's also a part of Achille Mbembe's Necropolitics, a book that I don't even pretend to understand. But Agamben investigated how the state of exception can be extended. For example, prisoners in the war on terror being held for indefinite periods of time, or a state of exception can be used to reduce people to precarity and justify extrajudicial killings, and that the state of exception becomes a norm. But that's actually part of Carl Schmitt's point. Right? The state of exception for him is the norm. So there's this tension. There's a recognition that in most Republican and Democratic forms of governments, there will be crises where you have to institute a new government and you have to reset the rule of law, even to maintain the democratic polity itself. And yet, that very tension undoes democracy. Now, if you don't see how this has been related to both the imperial presidency in the United States and the way that Democrats have used rhetoric about the imminent danger of the end of democracy while also not really doing anything about it, it's kind of a catch-22, because what are they supposed to do? If they try to save democracy by ending democracy, they are seen as tyrannical by a good portion of the population. And if they don't do anything, they're seen as not taking it seriously. Which means the gambit of invoking the crisis of democracy is always a challenge, because you are going to be invoking a state of emergency and then a continued state of exception. But this is also in Marxist politics, guys. The dictatorship of the proletariat is not a dictatorship for the proletariat. I think I've read all kinds of books that make this clear, from Hunt to Hal Draper and Balabar and. It is a state of exception for the working class to rule, not undemocratically, but to remove people who aren't part of the class from the democratic process until they are part of the class. It is not just about killing everybody who's ever been outside of the working class. It's about universalizing working class politics. And once you join the working class, then you become part of the political body that makes the rules because you are contributing to the work of society. That's the Marxian idea. And we know that's the Marxian idea because he was arguing against a more Pontius view from the Blanquists, who also used the term dictatorship of the proletariat in their interventions in the First International to mean a secret coterie of dictatorship. And it's also basically what Marx accuses the Bakutinists of, rightly or wrongly. And I think there's evidence in both directions. So the state of exception is both the basis of sovereignty for Schmitt, but also its undoing of republicanism. It is an extension of the state of emergency. And Agamben's right that the state of exception, once invoked, tends to stay invoked. Think about Sadat's statement of emergency being reinstated and then it not falling down until the Arab Spring, only to be reinstated in 2016 and only being removed after al-Sisi has clearly solidified his power base in Egypt, for example. Now, what does that mean for radical thinkers? Well, the problem that you have is you do have to institute a state of exception. A revolution is itself a kind of state of exception, a very bloody one often. Although the argument Marx has traditionally made is it would be not very bloody because once you expropriated the property of the minority who held it, it would be very easy to stop the violence pretty quickly. One of the things this assumes is that the working class is fairly unified and doesn't identify with any outside forces or the bourgeoisie itself, which is probably a bad assumption. And they should know that from the Narodniki and the peasantry, but nonetheless, it is the idea. And it's interesting that when you talk about like right-wingers who are constantly bringing up the fear of tyranny, like Alex Jones, for example, about FEMA camps and states of emergency being used to suppress the public, there's also a sense in which they also very much want that. Because, and you can see this today, and this is a theory that's not from Schmitt, when you can't justify something off of a kind of Republican self-rule where everyone's the sovereign in their area and they know each other, and you can't justify things off of confidence administrative power of administering that sovereignty for everybody, like the liberal state of the 20th century did, usually you have to justify things in the state of emergency, and that becomes a state of exception that is permanent. What do we do with that? Now, you can see how this can go crazy because it could lead to things like Agamben's fear of the lockdowns, right? As just a power grab, which there's nothing to that, even if they are necessary, right? Even if the lockdowns are necessary to protect life, if they worked, and I'm not here to debate that today. When I look at epidemiological stuff, that whether the lockdown works seems pretty questionable. But you can use that to instantiate a permanent state of exception, and a lot of leftists wanted to. But it hardly ever goes in a leftist direction. The question becomes, this reestablishment of something more democratic would require a suspension of the rule of law, because the rule of law has both democratic and anti-democratic features in most modern bourgeois republics, and they becoming less and less democratic over time, as many, many people have studied. The administrative state itself is a way to get around democracy. The Democrats are scared of their own democracy. If you don't believe that, look at how they handle primaries. They instituted the primaries to make the thing more democratic, and they've been trying to get around them for the past 2 decades. But to understand the state of exception, one has to understand sovereignty as the legitimate authority in an area. And then one must realize that Marxists, including Leninists, by the way, I mean, Lenin says after the dictatorship of the proletariat, you start to take down the notion of sovereignty because it implies a class hierarchy in the mode of production. Because to have a sovereign usually means you need a standing army. To have a standing army, you have to supply that standing army and remove them from everyday work. That's the idea. Go back and read State and Revolution for where he works this out. And when people push to abandon that, they are basically saying we do not believe in a classless society because we think we always need some kind of state of exception to emerge with a particular leader to execute it no matter what. I think this is something that Marxists need to think more about, but unfortunately, usually we get stuck in the games about the origins of the problem. And I want to make clear, it is very clear that Schmitt's goal with this is to establish authoritarian sovereignty in a republican or constitutional polity. It's important to understand this to understand a lot of the 20th century. I hope this little explainer makes it clear to you to bind that invoking the state of exception, whether it was the GOP with the war on terror and the Democrats with them too, honestly, or the constant internal states of exception are being invoked today by constant emergencies, are a way to shore up sovereignty when these people don't really have popular sovereignty behind them. Hence the division in the country, hence a bunch of things that can't easily be resolved without appeals to emergency. So whether or not we like this class collaboration as politics implied by Schmitt and Hobbes, etc., and clearly I don't, it's important to understand it because we see it manifesting all over the modern political landscape. Anyway, I hope this protects your peace. Take care. Like and subscribe if you like this. Just want to hear a guy talk about it. There's more behind the Patreon wall. And you cannot see me, which is maybe its own benefit. Take care. Protect you.